The small case fixed to the doorpost is empty, and that is where the entire misunderstanding begins. You have passed 100 such cases without thinking about the absence inside them, without asking what parchment they once guarded and why the words on that parchment were commanded to live at the threshold of every Jewish home. The case commands attention, but the words it holds have been flattened by familiarity into something they were never meant to be. Tonight, we open the case and pull out the scroll, and we discover that the most famous prayer in the Jewish world has been reduced by synagogues and churches alike to a statement about God when it was always something far more demanding. It was a command about you. You have heard the words 100 times, maybe 1,000. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The opening of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. They roll off the tongue in synagogue and church with the comfortable weight of a well-worn stone, smooth from handling, easy to recite, easy to nod along with. But what if the first word of that sentence has been quietly mistranslated in a way that changes everything downstream of it? What if the sentence was never primarily a declaration about God's existence or God's unity, but a demand for your total allegiance, spoken into the ear of a people who needed to choose whose side they were on? Most synagogues treat the Shema as a confession of monotheism. Most churches treat it as a proof text for the doctrine of God, and both, in their own way, have missed the original force of the command. The question is not whether the Shema teaches that God is one. The question is what the first word of the sentence was calling Israel to do when they stood at the edge of the Jordan, about to enter a land full of other gods. This is where the detective work begins, and the first clue is hidden in plain sight inside a single Hebrew word. That word is the very word that names the prayer itself, the word Shema, which translators render as hear, but which carried a weight in the ancient world that no English word quite captures. If you have ever wondered why the most important declaration in Judaism begins with a command to listen rather than a statement of belief, you are already asking the right question. The answer will reshape how you understand not only this prayer, but the entire shape of biblical faith. Let us go back to the moment this command was first spoken. Deuteronomy is structured as a series of speeches delivered by Moses to the gathered people of Israel, standing on the plains of Moab, looking across the river at the land they are about to inherit. This is not a quiet moment of private devotion. This is a nation being addressed on the eve of conquest, a generation that has wandered in the wilderness and is now being given the terms of its existence as a people. And into that charged atmosphere, Moses speaks the words that will become the heartbeat of Jewish prayer for 3,000 years. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But here is what we miss when we read those words in our comfortable sanctuaries. They were spoken to a people surrounded by nations who worshipped many gods, and the command was not an abstract theological proposition, but a call to exclusive loyalty. The Hebrew word Shema does not mean hear in the way you hear a noise in the next room. It means hear with the intention of responding. It means listen and obey, attend and act, take in and do. In the ancient Near East, the verb Shema was the language of a vassal treaty, the word a king used when demanding that a subordinate nation listen to his terms and submit to them. When a suzerain said Shema to his covenant partner, he was not asking them to acknowledge that he existed. He was demanding their total allegiance. So when Moses cries out Shema to Israel, he is not inviting them to agree with a doctrine. He is summoning them to a covenant loyalty that will bind their hearts, their wills, and their whole lives to the God who rescued them from Egypt. Let that sit for a moment, because it cracks open the familiar in a way that can feel unsettling. You have probably recited this verse or heard it recited as a statement about God's unity. And it does affirm that. but the grammar of the sentence pulls in a different direction. The phrase Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, from Deuteronomy 6:4 can be read in more than one grammatically valid way. One reading gives us the Lord is one. Another gives us the Lord alone is our God. And that second reading is not an eccentric departure from the text. It aligns perfectly with the covenant context, with the command that follows, with the entire thrust of Deuteronomy as a book about exclusive loyalty to one God. The Shema is not primarily a philosophical statement about the nature of God. It is a declaration of allegiance, a renunciation of every other loyalty, spoken by a people who were about to enter a land where every nation had its own gods. Now watch how the command expands, because the very next verse, Deuteronomy 6:5, tells you what hearing is supposed to produce. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And here is where both traditions stumble in different ways. Synagogues have often read this as the core of Jewish identity, the confession that marks you as part of the covenant people. Churches have often read it as the ground of Christian devotion, the greatest commandment that Jesus himself quoted. But both tend to freeze the words into a formula, a prayer to be recited, a belief to be affirmed, a text to be quoted in defense of one doctrine or another. What the original command demands is neither a formula nor a belief, but a life. The connection between hearing and loving is the key that unlocks the whole passage. In the ancient world, love in the context of covenant was not primarily an emotion. It was a term of political allegiance. When a treaty said that a vassal must love his suzerain, it meant he must be loyal to him, serve him, fight for him, forsake all other alliances. So when Deuteronomy commands Israel to love God with all their heart, soul, and strength, it is not commanding a warm feeling. It is commanding total allegiance, a love that expresses itself in obedience, a love that refuses every rival claim on your life. That is why the command to love follows directly from the command to hear. Hearing that God alone is your God produces the love that binds you utterly to Him. Have you ever felt the ache of saying words you did not fully mean, of reciting a confession that had become hollow through repetition? That ache is not a failure of your devotion. It is the echo of a misunderstanding that has shaped both synagogue and church for centuries. We have turned a command into a creed, an allegiance into an affirmation, a demand for total life into a nod of intellectual assent. And somewhere in that translation, the force of the original word was lost. Shema was never meant to be something you say. It was meant to be something you do. The word itself, in its very grammar, refuses to be reduced to mere hearing. It demands a response. It insists on obedience. It calls you not to acknowledge God, but to bind yourself to Him. Think about what it would mean to actually live inside that word. Every morning and every evening, observant Jews recite the Shema, and the words are meant to be a constant, rhythmic reminder of this total allegiance. The command in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 7 through 9, goes on to say that these words should be on your heart, that you should teach them to your children, that you should talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. And then the passage gives a physical sign. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them be as frontlets between your eyes. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. The prayer was never meant to stay in the realm of the abstract. It was meant to be worn on the body, inscribed on the thresholds of homes, repeated until it became the very rhythm of existence. That shift from hearing to obedience, from reciting to binding yourself to God, it changes everything about how we read Scripture. If you want to keep uncovering the physical evidence behind words we have too often reduced to doctrines, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. In the space below, comment the word threshold if you are seeing the Shema differently now. not as a creed to recite, but as a life to wear. You have probably seen the leather boxes strapped to the arm and forehead during morning prayer, the small cases we call phylacteries or tefillin in Hebrew. Have you ever stopped to ask why the command to love God with all your strength would be physically bound to your body? The act of binding is the meaning. The tefillin press against the skin and bone, a constant tactile reminder that the allegiance is not a thought in your head, but a reality lived out in your limbs, your actions, your daily movements. In the same way, the mezuzah fixed to the doorpost marks the home as a place of covenant, a physical declaration that every time you cross the threshold, you are entering a space owned by God. These are not decorative traditions. They are the Shema made physical, made tactile, made impossible to forget. This is the layer most people never see, and it changes the entire texture of the prayer. The Shema is not a sentence to be contemplated. It is a life to be bound. And when the church later took up these words, something remarkable happened, something that most Christians today have never noticed. Jesus, when asked which commandment was the greatest, did not answer with a law from the 10 Commandments. He reached back to this very passage, to the command to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he did something unexpected. He did not stop with the Shema. In Mark chapter 12, verses 29 and 30, and in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 39, Jesus joins the command to love God with a second command from Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. He announces that these two together hold all the law and the prophets. To appreciate what Jesus was doing, you need to feel the weight of that moment. A teacher of the law, an expert in Scripture, has asked him to name the greatest commandment, a question that was debated among the rabbis of his day. And Jesus responds by quoting the Shema, the most sacred declaration in all of Judaism, the words every Jewish child learned before any other, but he reframes it. He sets the command to love God in direct connection to the command to love neighbor. And in doing so, he reveals that the allegiance the Shema demands was never meant to be a private devotion. It was always meant to flow outward into love for others. The Shema, in other words, is not a wall around the soul. It is a door. The binding of heart, soul, and strength to God opens you to the neighbor standing in front of you. There is a moment in Mark chapter 12, verses 32 through 34, where this exchange unfolds. And the scribe who heard Jesus respond is said to have acknowledged that Jesus had answered wisely, that to love God and neighbor is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. And Jesus tells him, he is not far from the kingdom of God. That is a stunning endorsement. The Shema, the very heart of Jewish faith, is placed by Jesus at the center of his own teaching, and then extended in a direction that the careful reader might not have expected, because the command to love God with all your strength is immediately paired with the command to love your neighbor as yourself. The vertical allegiance and the horizontal practice are fused into a single movement. You cannot Shema God and ignore the person in front of you. Paul, the apostle who carried this message into the Gentile world, understood the weight of this reworking. In his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 8, verse 6, he takes the Shema itself and bends it toward Christ in a way that would have been shocking to his Jewish contemporaries, where Deuteronomy declares that the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Paul writes that for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things. He takes the most sacred confession of Jewish faith and announces that the oneness of God is now understood through the lordship of Jesus. The Shema does not disappear in the early church. It is transformed, its allegiance redirected, its command to love expanded to embrace the crucified and risen Messiah. And this is where the tension between synagogue and church becomes sharpest, and also where each tradition holds something the other has lost. The synagogue preserved the daily rhythm of the Shema, the binding of the words onto the body, the marking of the doorposts, the constant repetition that kept the allegiance alive in the bones of the people. But in preserving the confession, it has sometimes frozen it into an identity marker rather than a living demand. The church, on the other hand, received the Shema through the words of Jesus and Paul, understanding it as the ground of love for God and neighbor. But in doing so, it has often lost the physical texture of the command, the binding, the marking, the daily repetition that made it a way of life rather than a doctrine to affirm. Both have the words. Both have missed the full weight of the original demand. The Hebrew word echad, often translated as one, carries its own surprising nuance. And here the evidence from the rest of the Torah helps illuminate what the Shema is doing. When Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 describes a man and woman becoming one flesh, the word used is echad. When the people of Israel are described as gathered together as one man, the word is echad. The word does not mean a solitary, isolated unit. It means a unified whole, a oneness that can contain plurality, a singularity that emerges from a binding together. So when Deuteronomy declares that the Lord is echad, it is not offering a philosophical definition of God's inner nature. It is declaring that the Lord alone is Israel's God, that He is the one to whom their allegiance belongs, and that this allegiance must unify them as a people, just as God Himself is one. Let you feel the texture of this for a moment, because the physical world of the Shema is not distant from us. Imagine standing on the plains of Moab with dust on your sandals, the river Jordan glinting in the distance, a people who have been wandering for 40 years, finally hearing the terms of their existence. The words are not abstract propositions delivered from a safe distance. They are a covenant oath spoken at the moment of decision, a call to choose whose side you are on before you cross into a land where every hilltop has its own altar and every nation its own God. And the first word of that oath is Shema. Listen, not just with your ears, with your whole life. You have probably heard the Shema recited many times and felt that it was a statement about God's greatness, a confession of faith to be affirmed. And you were not wrong to hear that. But the original force of the command was something more demanding. It was a summons to allegiance, a call to renounce every other loyalty and bind yourself wholly to the God who had rescued you. And that is why the command immediately moves from hearing to love, from love to teaching, from teaching to binding on the body and marking on the doorposts. The Shema was never meant to stay in the mouth. It was meant to descend into the hands, the feet, the thresholds of every home, the fabric of every day. That image of the Shema moving from hearing to the body, to the doorposts and the thresholds of a home, was never meant to remain in the past. I want to keep uncovering these moments where faith becomes something you can touch. And if you feel that same pull, I invite you to subscribe and walk with me as we trace the physical texture of Scripture together. So let me ask you, what does it look like for the Shema to descend into the rhythms of your own daily life? Leave a word or a practice in the comments. I would genuinely love to hear how you are binding this allegiance to your ordinary moments. When the rabbis of later generations reflected on this command, they understood that the Shema was not merely a prayer to be recited, but a declaration that carried the weight of martyrdom. There is a tradition that the first verse of the Shema should be recited even in the face of death, that a Jew who is given the choice between apostasy and death should affirm the oneness of God with the Shema on their lips. That tradition points back to the original force of the word. Shema is not a passive hearing. It is an active allegiance that holds nothing back, not even life itself. And when Jesus quoted the Shema and called it the greatest commandment, He was reaching back through centuries of Jewish tradition to the same foundational demand. Love God with everything you are, he said, and love your neighbor as yourself. Here is what nobody told you about the structure of the Shema itself. In Jewish liturgy, this prayer is not one verse, but 3 passages from the Torah, recited together morning and evening. The first is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, the command to love God and teach these words to your children. The second is Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 through 21, which adds the promise of blessing for obedience and the warning of consequences for turning away. The third is Numbers chapter 15, verses 37 through 41, which commands the wearing of tassels on the garments as a reminder of all the Lord's commandments. Each passage reinforces the others. Love is commanded, but love is linked to obedience. Obedience is linked to remembrance, and remembrance is made physical through the tassels that hang from the garments, through the tefillin bound on arm and forehead, through the mezuzah fixed to the doorpost. The entire prayer is engineered to move from the mouth to the memory, to the body, to the home. Let us pause and take in what we have uncovered so far, because the layers are accumulating in a way that demands a response. The word Shema means hear and obey, not simply listen. The phrase Adonai Echad is less a philosophical definition than a declaration of exclusive covenant loyalty. The command to love God with all heart, soul, and strength comes straight out of ancient treaty language, where love meant allegiance, not sentiment. The physical practices of tefillin, mezuzah, and tassels exist to bind this allegiance into the daily rhythms of life. And Jesus, in quoting this command as the greatest, joined it to the command to love neighbor, revealing that the allegiance to God was always meant to flow outward. Every layer, every piece of evidence points in the same direction. The Shema is not a creed to be recited. It is a life to be lived. Now we come to the question that has been building since the opening words. If we have both been getting it wrong, synagogue and church alike, what did the Shema originally mean? And what does it mean if we finally let it mean what it always meant? The answer is both simple and terrifying. The Shema is a command to give your whole self to God, not in a single moment of confession, but in the unbroken fabric of every day. It is the daily renewal of an allegiance that holds nothing back. It is the recognition that God alone is your God, that no other loyalty can stand beside this one, and that this allegiance must take shape in love for God and love for neighbor. If the Shema is truly heard, if it is truly obeyed, it changes everything. The climax of this uncovering is not a doctrine to be affirmed, but a posture to be assumed. Hear, O Israel. The words were spoken to a people, not to an individual. They were spoken to a community being formed, a people being bound together by a shared allegiance to the one God who had rescued them from slavery. And that is why the command moves so quickly from the individual heart to the teaching of children, to the conversations in the home, to the marking of the doorposts and gates. The Shema was never meant to be a private piety. It was meant to be the constitution of a people, the founding allegiance of a community that would live differently from every other nation because it was bound to a different Lord. When we recite the Shema alone, we are joining a chorus that has been sung for 3,000 years. And here is the weight that settles on you when the layers finally converge. The Shema is not a statement about God that you can affirm and then walk away from. It is a command that demands your entire existence. When you say, "The Lord is our God, the Lord is one," you are not merely acknowledging that God exists or even that God is one being. You are declaring that this God and no other is your God. You are renouncing every rival allegiance, every competing loyalty, every claim on your heart and soul and strength that would displace the lordship of the one who rescued you. And in the same breath, you are committing yourself to love, not a feeling, an enacted, embodied, daily, costly love that binds you to God and to your neighbor. You might have thought that the Shema was the most basic, the most elementary, the most comfortable of all biblical texts. And in one sense it is. It is the first prayer a Jewish child learns. It is the last words a dying Jew hopes to speak. But that simplicity is deceptive. The Shema is the hinge on which the entire biblical vision of faith turns. It is the command that gathers up the whole of the law and the prophets, the declaration that Jesus himself identified as the greatest commandment. To truly hear the Shema is to be pulled into a way of life that holds nothing back. It is to hear the voice of God saying, "I am your God," and to respond with the only answer that makes sense.
Do not be afraid.
I
The
am
light
yours.
endures forever, and you
Let
are
us
its
sit in
reflection.
that for a
Have
moment,
faith in the path
because the
before you.
demand of the
Kingdom of heaven
Shema
is like a treasure
is
hidden in
not
a field.
something you can rush
Then the
past.
man goes and
It
sells
is a
all that he
claim
has
on
to
your
buy that
life
field.
that, once truly heard, cannot be unheard. The words have been with you from the beginning of this journey, and they will be with you long after the video has ended. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And the command that follows, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. The love that is commanded is not a warm glow in the chest. It is the love of covenant, the love of allegiance, the love that binds you so completely that every other loyalty becomes relative, every other claim secondary, every other devotion a dim reflection of the one that owns you wholly. Now the question turns toward you, and it is a question you cannot delegate. What would it look like for you to truly Shema God? Not to recite the words, though the words have their place. Not merely to affirm the doctrine, though the doctrine stands. But to hear with the intention of responding, to listen with the commitment to obey, to attend to God in a way that binds your heart and soul and strength to Him in total allegiance. This is the shape of the Shema made personal. It is the recognition that God alone is your God, and that this allegiance must reshape the way you love, the way you live, the way you spend your days. The Shema was never meant to be a prayer you say. It was meant to be a life you live. That question, what would it look like for you to truly Shema God, is one you will carry beyond this video. Subscribe to continue walking with us through the evidence that calls you to give God your full allegiance, not as a theory, but as a daily reality. And in the comments, drop one word that captures what it would look like for you to live the Shema this week, to hear God and let that hearing change everything. Imagine what it would mean if this command were to take root in you the way the tefillin press against the arm and forehead. Imagine waking each morning with the awareness that God alone is your God, that your allegiance is claimed. Imagine moving through your day with the command to love God and neighbor written on your heart, shaping every conversation, every decision, every encounter. Imagine lying down at night and returning again to the words that have carried the people of God for 3,000 years. Hear, O Israel, not a distant echo of an ancient prayer, but a living command spoken into your own life. Shema, hear and do, listen and obey, attend and respond. This is the Shema in its full, undiminished, demanding glory. And yet, even here, there is another layer to notice, a texture in the text that most readers pass over without pause. The command to love God with all your heart, soul, and strength is followed immediately by a command to teach these words to your children, to impress them on the next generation, to speak of them in every context of life. The Shema was never meant to stop with the one who hears it. It is a command that demands to be passed on, spoken, taught, embedded in the life of the family and the community. To truly hear the Shema is to become someone who speaks it to others, who impresses it on the next generation, who refuses to let the allegiance die with you. The hearing of the Shema carries within it the summons to teach. This is where the ache that opened our journey finds its resolution. The ache of hollow words, of confessions recited without weight, of a faith that has been flattened into something you say rather than something you live. That ache is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that you were made for more than mere affirmation. The Shema calls you to a love that engages your whole being, a hearing that issues in obedience, an allegiance that binds you to God and flows out into love for your neighbor. When the familiar words crack open and reveal this demand, the ache begins to heal, because the hollow formula is replaced by a living command. You are not a spectator to this ancient prayer. You are being summoned to hear it, to obey it, to live it. The story of the Shema does not end with the words of Deuteronomy. It echoes through the prophets who call Israel again and again to hear the word of the Lord and respond in obedience. It echoes through the rabbis who built the daily practice of the prayer into the very fabric of Jewish life. It echoes through Jesus, who named the Shema the greatest commandment and joined it to the command to love neighbor. It echoes through Paul, who took the confession of God's oneness and proclaimed that it is fulfilled in the Lordship of Christ. And it echoes through history down to this very moment, to a person watching a video about the real meaning of the Shema, to you who have now heard what most synagogue and church have missed. The question is whether you will truly hear it. Let us return one final time to the physical world of the Shema, because the concrete things carry the invisible reality. Picture the leather straps of the tefillin winding around the arm, 7 turns, each one a reminder of a promise. Picture the small box resting against the forehead, containing the words of the Shema written on parchment. Picture the mezuzah on the doorpost, angled slightly as it has hung for centuries, marking the threshold as a place of covenant. These objects exist because the Shema refused to stay in the realm of thought. It demanded to be bound, worn, inscribed, made physical. The abstract became concrete because the allegiance it commands is meant to touch every part of life. And that is still the invitation of the Shema today, not merely to think about God's oneness, but to let it bind you, shape you, claim you. There is a stillness that settles when you begin to hear the Shema as it was originally meant to be heard. It is the stillness of a heart that has stopped trying to hold on to every competing loyalty and has finally surrendered to the one allegiance that gives life. It is the stillness of a mind that has stopped reducing God to a doctrine and has begun to respond to Him as Lord. It is the stillness of a life that has discovered that to hear is to obey, and that obedience is not a burden but a homecoming. In that stillness, the words of the ancient prayer become what they were always meant to be, not a formula to recite, but a command that holds your whole life in its grip. The Shema remains a living word. It was spoken to a people at the edge of the Jordan, and it is spoken still to everyone who has ever stood at the edge of a decision and wondered which way to go. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone is our God. And because He alone is God, you are free to love Him with everything you are, and free to love your neighbor as yourself. This is the real meaning of the Shema, not a creed to be affirmed, not a doctrine to be defended, but an allegiance to be lived, a love to be embodied, a hearing that becomes doing, a listening that becomes life. When the familiar words finally crack open and you see what they have always carried, you cannot unsee it. You can only begin to live it. If that image of an allegiance that finally becomes a life stays with you, subscribe and keep walking with us through the evidence that turns doctrine into a way of living. And in the comments, leave the word Shema if you are ready to let hearing become obedience starting today.